Welcome to the Small Town Podcast, a resource for arts professionals. I'm Sarah Roach-Lewis, and I'm excited to talk today to Becka Viau Pan Wendt a little bit about the professionalization of artists. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that Becka Viau has her Bachelor's of Fine Arts, a Master in Fine Arts, and has a Meritorious Service Medal for her work in contemporary art on Prince Edward Island. So for all of that, she's an artistic leader celebrated for her capacity to manage multi-venue and interdisciplinary events, engage various levels of government through fundraising and partnerships. She pushes the boundaries of artist as manager and thrives in the role of a multidisciplinary festival artistic director. She has extensive experience managing and coordinating multi-venue events, including, but not limited to, Flotilla 2017, Art in the Open, Reading Town PEI, and the Island Literary Awards. Her collaborative approach is key to her successes and her ability to build focused teams and reach varied audiences, which allows her to communicate across a broad funding base. Becka believes in the social impact of connecting people to and fostering the creation and dissemination of a high standard of contemporary art and critical discourse. With Becka today we have Pan Wendt, who's the curator at the Confederation Center Art Gallery in Charlottetown since 2010. He's co-curator of the Art in Open since its inception in 2011. And aside from his curatorial practice, he is a critic, writer, art historian, and event producer. He's also currently teaching art history at UPEI. He was trained as an art historian at Williams College and at Yale University. He has published widely and has served on numerous national juries, including the Sobey Art Award, RBC National Painting Competition, and the Canada Council of the Arts. His notable exhibition projects include Funk Aesthetics, Hank Bull, Connections, James Lee Byers, Letters from the World's Most Famous Unknown Artist, Who's Your Mother, and Colleen Wollstonholme, A Divided Room. So thank you both for joining me. And I'd love to just jump in and hear from you a little bit about, what are the pros and the cons of the professionalization of artists, and why is that something that we need to talk about?
Okay, I'll jump in. So it's Becka, and I think, there's a good debate around professionalization. Do artists need to be business folks in order to be successful or not? I think, or what language are artists using, I think is a debate all the time. But to be honest, I feel like if you're going to get money for your work in Canada, just in the system that we operate in, you have to be able to articulate yourself in a professional manner in order to be competitive. So I would say that it's pretty required, to have a professional presence and be able to present yourself professionally to the institutions you're looking to enter or receive funding from. But then it's like, you can outsource that as well, because should artists be good at everything, really, is what it comes down to for me.
What's your perspective on that, Pan?
Yeah, I basically agree. I think that one thing I have noticed is that I see a lot of artists, to my mind, wasting too much time on the kind of career side of things. And in a way, art school encourages that because you're sort of treated almost right away the minute you enter your first class as if you're already an artist. The whole idea that you would train for years and then become an artist is almost not the case anymore. In fact, you're sort of a de facto artist the minute you enter your first crit. So people are already starting to kind of think about promoting themselves and these kinds of things right away. And what I see is sometimes it's a way of avoiding doing your work. You spend more time thinking about grants, thinking about funding, marketing, websites, and this sort of thing. So I really like the idea of artists farming that out to a certain extent to people who do that. Unless, like in the case of Becka, for example, your work actually engages with this whole question of being a small business. So.
I also feel like, like spending a lot of time on your career, but I think like there's a way around that. Like maybe you don't have to farm it out, but as someone who receives a lot of proposals, it is frustrating to get badly written proposals. One way that I suggest for people to help them is to record a discussion with someone they know who knows the language of contemporary art that they can discuss. Sometimes it's a group, and then from that recording, you can write. Then take that recording and then write what you need to write about your project, instead of trying to come up with it as you're in the process of making or art, like actually doing the artistic work. So that's a tactic I sometimes throw out to people when they're like, I just don't know why the jury's not getting my project description, or, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of artist statements are really bad, to put it bluntly. I was on a jury once where, I was reading so many horrible artist statements that I just sort of tested it and realized that I actually liked the work better when I didn't read the statement. So that's a kind of a red flag about artist statements. And I think the biggest mistake artists make is try to make claims for what they do that are unsustainable. You're much better off being somewhat honest, both intellectually and just in terms of description, about your practice, what you do. Very simply, what it is. You're trying to explain your work to somebody who's not in the presence of the work. So simple description can do a lot more of your process and so forth than trying to say, well, I'm essentially changing the nature of society and language or something. That can get really, really ridiculous. So, I mean, I think that also the other thing I know Becka mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, writing your artist statement can be a way of, understanding your own work. So even the process of describing art is a kind of interpretation and it's critical in a way. So it's a part of the process of criticizing and understanding your own work.
So there's
Can be
almost
useful.
I think there's almost a part of that. So on the one hand, what is the role of the artist statement in this whole process of professionalization? So, I mean, Pan, what you're saying is it actually is a process to help the artist understand what they're doing. And also that other piece to it is to be able to simply describe to someone who's reading your work, rather than full of the airy-fairy, let's look at the thesaurus and find a whole bunch of words.
Well, I think it's interesting thinking about the podcast about stress relief, and just like how knowing yourself is very key to being present in what you're doing and handling other people and conflict resolution. But knowing yourself as an art practitioner and what you actually practice and how you practice is knowing yourself. So it is a tool, I think. When I reread my artist statement, I was like, oh, I better read my artist statement. It is about connecting that practice and the truth. You need to connect with the truth of yourself, of what you're doing, in order to clearly lay that out. I'm sure that the artist statement that was, if it's making big claims about changing the world and everything, it just makes me feel like the artist is egotistical, it's not actually speaking to the process or the practice of it.
I mean, the artist talk can also be a useful way of, I would encourage every artist who's at that threshold of possibly wanting to try to make a vocation of it, make a living at it, to begin thinking about how to talk about your work in a systematic way. I mean, I don't think that artworks are just discrete objects that stand alone anymore. The reality is that we are in a much more context-driven moment of art making and reception. And that includes part of that context that you create for the work or interact with is yourself. Artists kind of have to be able to stand next to their work in a way. They represent their work. They're even sometimes part of the work. That's unavoidable now. And they often, travel around with the work. When you install a show, you may well be, in some sense, either performing or talking about it as part of the process. So.
And is that different? Has that evolved over the years?
Absolutely. I mean, when the Confederation Center Art Gallery was built in 1964, and you can really feel it in the architecture in every piece of facility, in the design of the galleries and so forth, that it was designed to put paintings on the wall and maybe a couple sculptures. And everything from the size of the loading docks to everything else is geared around this idea that art is something that you put in a box and you transport around. And then you take it out of the box, you put it on the wall, and you light it properly, and then you have a work. But now, I mean, more often than not, what you're supporting is something called a project, or an installation, which involves the entire architecture. The whole situation has changed for sure, and we do work outside the gallery now, and that often involves artists being there.
Yeah, and I mean, like, when I think about, like, the artist biography, that used to be an art form in itself. And there was artists that would just run on their bios, right? Like, they wouldn't actually have any work. They would just have their biography, right? So I think, like, out of that, like, the artist statement has maybe transformed out of that era or that time. I can't think of what time frame that's from, but
Well, you're thinking like Joseph Beuys.
Yes, like
life work. What's it called? Life course, work course, something like that, where his biography is clearly
the work.
The work.
Yeah. But like moving on from like the artist statement is just, I feel like it's something that can make you more sure in yourself as a creator, and can also help contextualize the project that you're proposing. So like usually when I write a grant, I will think about my artist statement, and that's how I will open my project proposal, is like, this is how I work, this is why I work this way, and this is what this is why this project is coming out of me, right? So, but I start with my practice as like the opening part of then my application, which would be the project description. But it's really important to know like where you're coming from as a maker, or to know yourself as an artist, to be able to articulate that, because how can you articulate your growth or your development, which most grants want to see, movement in your practice, not necessarily your career, but your artistic making. So you have to be able to articulate how that's progressing in your project description. So what better way to like put it at the very beginning, like, this is how I work, this is what I'm gonna do, this is why it is impactful to my practice, or is going to change my practice, or is continuing the discussion of my practice, or, So I think like knowing that solidly is very important. But then you get into project descriptions and CVs and
But you're ultimately
portfolios.
Creating a narrative, right?
Exactly.
And whether you might not like that or you might not want to perpetuate that, but if you want to get around it, you have to do that fairly intentionally, and with a full understanding of what it is you're trying to get around. Now, PEI, are we responding to the context of PEI?
Well, so I mean, like, this is a small town thing. So.
Yeah, so PEI is a very particular context, and one of the really key things that can affect how things work on PEI is that a lot of people come to PEI or stay on PEI specifically to avoid all of these issues. So you go to PEI to avoid having to deal with the art world. I mean, if you're here and you're wanting to engage with the art world, you're making a mistake probably. I mean, ultimately PEI has a lot of limitations in terms of its level of connection to the art world. So if you're here to avoid the art world, then that means that ultimately you can't have any illusions about whether or not you should be succeeding in that art world. As long as you understand that by coming here you've made certain sacrifices in terms of your lack of regular engagement with this larger art world, then that's okay. There's no reason why anybody has to be part of that. But let's not have any illusions about what's going on. So I think there's a long history of that in PEI. So to take examples, Hilda Woolnow, important PEI artist, but the moment that she made that decision to stick it out in PEI, she actually slowly, over time, lost her connection to the larger discourse, and her work actually became more and more private and more a kind of personal project that didn't connect with larger discussions. And that's okay. That can be a good choice, but you have to be aware that that's what you're doing.
Do you think that there's a way to marry the two?
Yeah, there is, but I mean, especially now that we have such a huge digital communications system, right? And I mean, there is the Confederation Center Art Gallery there that does bring a connection to contemporary art, and of course there are institutions like this Town is Small, but I just think it's important to understand that you can connect these things, but you're always making a decision to not be at the center of the universe, the art universe, if you're in a place like PEI.
Yeah, we're remote. And disconnected from the rest of the art scene, that's for sure. And, you do have to stay connected in some ways. I think about moving back here and really starting the idea of this town is small and being told, like, don't go to PEI, there's nothing there for you. But there is something great about PEI is that you sort of become a big fish in a small pond, let's just say.
Mm-hmm. You can create your own context.
You can create your own context. You can, it's a bit, I don't know. I find PEI a weird phenomenon. It impacts me because I grew up here as an artist, like as a person. It impacts me physically being here, but it also impacts like my conceptual way of thinking, ultimately being here, But
there's a lot of potential in PEI as an art context, but it's not so much I think it's a mistake for people to pursue an art career here. I just think that people need to not be innocent about what. Yeah,
like it's not a mistake to be here is what you're saying, but you just don't.
But be aware. Yeah, don't. I do run into a lot of instances where artists lose touch with the kind of conversation that is, contemporary art, and then don't understand why they're not getting, Canada Council grants. I'm thinking, well, if you're going to choose to be here, not only do you have to actively work to create that context, but you can't become complacent in terms of what your idea of what art is, in terms of whether or not you're relating to the current conversation. And one of the strange and I find actually really annoying facts about the art world and about contemporary art is its kind of obsession with being contemporary. And that isn't just an art thing. I mean, that's in every aspect of life, from what apps you're using and so on. You're constantly, this is sort of the nature of the contemporary world, that your contemporaneity is just like constantly in your face. Are you up to date? Are you connected? If your goal is to kind of keep up with that, PEI can be a very difficult place to be as an artist. And you just have to be aware of that. I actually personally love being disconnected, and I'm more and more turning, unsyncing things and getting off, having that kind of immediate relationship to everything. And I find actually it's a benefit. I can concentrate more. I can actually do something that has a little more substance. But that's how I feel about it. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case for a lot of people. So.
Well, and I mean, I could speak to the point of view that you made about, like we really are disconnected. We're rural, we're remote. Even though we're a province, we still, we're an island. So we're remote, we're rural, like we're a rural province. So I think articulating yourself or staying connected is really important, especially if you want to be able to articulate off island. So like if you're applying off island, I mean, to qualify for Canada Council, you need 2 professionally paid shows at recognized institutions. And I mean, lucky enough, we have the Confed Center and this Town is Small both paying professional fees here. So you can actually become Canada Council worthy I'll say in quotations.
Eligible, maybe?
Eligible is better, yeah. Here on PEI now, but before this Town M.S.M was offering professional fees, you would have to export out of province, and in order to do that, you need to be able to communicate with the institutions that you're applying to, or the curators you're talking to. Like, it would be so important to research, the mandate of the organization that you're applying to. Like, there's all these tips that you could do about applying to things off island, because that's ultimately what we have to do here if you're going to make money. I mean,
yes.
As an artist, not a commercial artist, right?
I mean, if you want to sell to tourists, that's different, but that'll really, really constrain your practice. I mean, you have very, very few options if your primary source of income is selling to tourists. So if you want to actually be an artist in the sense of the word that I think is still applicable, 200 odd years later, the idea of the artist as a sort of somewhat free individual, a person who's dedicated to creativity, and that is, doing something with very few constraints on their choices. Well, you really don't want to be dependent on the tourist market.
No.
But I think, to that point of that definition and hearing you talk, how constrained, like how free are you if you have to be thinking about the context of your art? You have to be thinking about, how do I write this grant? You have to be thinking about, how do I stay contemporary with what's happening in the art world when I live here, or do I make this choice? So how free are you as an artist in 2019?
Not really. Very free. No. Well, I mean, you're never, that's kind of the perennial question about art. I mean, how can you communicate without using existing language? How do you make a statement without at least having some engagement with already existing statements, right? So you're never truly free. But if you want to give yourself the maximum amount of options, I think that the market can be a very constraining factor, more constraining than, let's say, the discourse or the institutions. I think the market is much more restrictive in PEI. Now, if you were in New York, you'd have a pretty small chance of making it, but if you did, you'd have much more freedom because there's a significant art market.
Sure.
But here, like, when you talk about art market, there's no art market here. I mean,
no,
not really.
There's a great app, though, this international app now for artists, and I will put this in the resources. I can't remember the name of it because it has like a ridiculous name that has nothing to do with art, but it's basically like, it's a marketplace for artists internationally, and it's an app-based software that you put on your phone or whatever. You upload your images of your artwork. People can go on anywhere in the world, find you, and then like hold their phone up to the wall, and it will place the artwork on your wall, right? And then they can like choose if they like it or not, and then so people are buying, from Europe in the States off this app. And that's, I think like this is pretty brand new. I think they've only been going like for maybe 5 years. So like, I think that is going to change the marketplace. I think digital technology is going to change the marketplace in ways that we can't anticipate right now. But I mean, as an artist myself, like I do drawings and I make money off my drawings by selling them, and all I really do is post on Instagram that I'm selling, and that's how I get it out there. I'm not selling in stores, but I do that really because I'm cautious of the commercial landscape impeding on my artistic practice or impeding on my artistry, because I think that artists are really important and they should be free to create and express. And I think that's what complicates the professionalization of artists, is that, like, does an artist now have to do everything, including like social media marketing and all of this on the other side, of career, right? Is that really important? But how are you going to get seen, especially if you're in PEI? So maybe that's where it's like, if you come to PEI, it is a dangerous place to come if you want to,
But it can be a great place because,
yes.
all of that stuff, like we talked about right at the very beginning, can be a huge distraction and a way of procrastinating, in fact. I remember when I was struggling with my dissertation, I would spend a lot more time on my grant applications, It's like, I think artists can really get lost in all of that. And if they, coming to PEI, you can really get some privacy. They talk about, I heard this program on the radio the other day about open offices and how they're, actually totally unproductive because everybody's having meetings all the time. And I think the same can be true for the sort of social and sort of networking aspect of being an artist, that you only want to spend so much time at the cafe in the left bank. I think you need to go in your studio and like make some work. And that can be a very solitary activity. But in my experience, the best artists are often, that's what they're doing. They're workaholics on their actual work. And they're really, really intense about it. I don't know anybody harder working than artists, honestly. Like the really good artists. Yeah. They don't allow themselves to get too distracted by the career side of things.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to think about that in the context of like being a parent. Right? So like I have 2 small children now, and I can only commit so many hours a week to art practicing because I have to make money to feed my children, or like we need our shelter, we need clothes, we need this and that, and the art world's not really built for parents.
No.
And so like, it's like, I don't know, I just needed to say that.
I know, it's
like
really...
The art world is not made for that, and like the professional artists who can just workaholic it don't have kids, or they have a partner who is extremely supportive and is,
Yeah.
or like
in the old days, the artist was a man, and there would be a woman who would be like managing his life, and yeah.
Yeah, and maybe
so it
making
is really,
work on the side,
yeah.
or
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good example, actually, of how those boundaries between your sort of the practice of art and the professionalization, or sort of the kind of pragmatic side of things are, you can't really separate them fully.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you allow that stuff to take over, it's not always a choice. You have to make some money for one thing. But if you allow that stuff to take over, it can be really deadly on your art. So you have to somehow carve that space out. It's really essential.
Yeah, it's like carving out space for self-care.
For anything.
For anything, yeah. And
So how do you do that in a really practical sense?
Shut the door.
Book it in your schedule.
Yeah,
I book it in my schedule. Yeah. Like, and I think it depends on your type of practice too. Like, I'm really research-based when it comes to my work, and you'll see, like, if you visit my website, you'll see that I'm particular about what I have up there compared to what my drawings that are not up there. Like, I'm very research-oriented, so, like, my studio work might be reading a book,
Sure.
Like, that's my studio time and thinking and writing and journaling or whatever. It's not necessarily like making a big sculpture. So I think it's a little bit different, where I can take my practice home to my bed, and read a book. Some artists can't do that. But I do think it is like scheduling it. Like, I have to schedule it in because of the restraints of having 2 small children and another full-time working partner and needing to work myself, So, it's kind of like the economic realities of PEI as well. But
another thing that can be surprisingly helpful, weirdly enough, is austerity of PEI living.
Yes.
Can actually, I don't know, it sort of forces you to. It's a kind of, one of the difficulties of being a kind of, let's say, a modern or contemporary artist is this kind of blank canvas that's staring you in the face of like too many options. In a weird way, we have too many options. And a lot of art practice in the 20th century sort of revolved around artists trying to figure out a set of rules that they would then follow. But the kind of those artificial constraints or whatever external pressures that force you to do only a certain kind of artwork can be incredibly beneficial. Like I saw Stephen McGuinness, for example, a Charlottetown artist, who, when he was looking after the kids, he just literally could not make any work without them being there. So he had to totally transform his practice into something that involved the kids possibly messing it up. And that actually became part of the work.
Yeah.
And it also imposed these limitations on his work that were really, I thought they were really beneficial. In fact, I thought it really kind of improved his work. Not being free to do whatever was coming out of his head actually forced him to kind of like rethink his work a bit. And it was, I thought some of his strongest work was like made with kids' fingerprints all over it. So.
And I mean, like, we could talk about this in length, like the ethics of using your own children in your artwork as subjects. But like, I have done that. I've thought about motherhood as a topic, as, you know, how it's changed my life. But I think just thinking about like kids, or thinking about, especially the person, it mostly affects marginalized women, I would say, but women in general. The people who are carrying and birthing the children, basically, if they're artists, because you can end up having a 5-year gap or a 3-year gap in your CV in shows. You might be working, but then your CV shows this gap. And I've been around a lot of jury tables where that gap still is not just identified as like women artists. Like, we should be comfortable to say, I had a baby and I couldn't work for 5 years because I was looking after the brain development of this tiny human, you know, but we can't say that. So I think there's interesting ways of reworking your CV around that topic, but, you know, it's still part of like the sexist realities of, you know, industry in general, maybe. But also, like, we talk a lot about artist residencies, like how important they are on your CV now. Like, it's sort of like the experience of
maybe not on your
art,
CV, but in terms of your own development.
But I think on CVs too. Like, I think people are looking for residencies on CVs, right?
Really?
Like, if you're not doing residencies, I mean, like, and you have a big gap, then what are you doing, right? Like, it's,
Sure.
you know. But I do think like having kids does impact the CVs of women artists, and I don't think it's being addressed at the jury level, but I mean, I don't want to tell people not to have babies. I mean, most of the women in my studio have kids, so, you know.
Well, and I think that goes back to some of that when we want to look at what are the, you know, we often spend a lot of time looking at the personal barriers or the personal challenges, and what you're identifying is what are some of those structural and systemic barriers, and are there ways that the community itself can wrap its arms around mothers and women artists and say, you know, from that structural, like, what does that look like on a CV, or what does that look like on an artist statement, or these places where, you know, grants are given out.
Yeah. Or you've had an illness that has taken you out, or you've developed a chronic disorder or something, and it totally changes your life. Like, can you just honestly say that as an artist in your statement? Yes. Do curators read them? I don't know. You know, do they go straight to the CV? Do they go straight to the images? Like, you know, what's more important? I don't know.
It's a tough call because, in a certain sense, you can do some things to kind of mitigate those factors, but ultimately, nobody cares whether, you know, such and such an artist was sick and couldn't work for a while. It's like, oh, that's too bad. But they're not really.
Yeah,
it's not going to change the evaluation of the work. So ultimately, we are stuck with this problem that artworks are, to some extent, outside of our biography. I mean, we can be intertwined with them, but when we talked about Joseph Beuys's biography, we were talking about a semi-fictional biography.
Yes, exactly.
After all.
A lot of artists were making fictional biographies.
And so, you know, ultimately, an artwork is ultimately something that stands outside of yourself and your biography. And what it does in the outside world is ultimately separate from the conditions under which it was made. So as much as we can try to help artists with these kind of limitations, and, you know, having kids is a big one, or any kind of other problem, like, you know.
Yeah.
But in the end, you know, life is brutal. Like, in the end, if you have to quit making art to eat food, nobody's going to care.
Yeah, I mean, because like
It's tough.
the people around the jury. I mean, another thing is like most works are peer assessed. Even in artist-run centers, generally are peer assessed exhibitions. Even so, like from grants to ARCs, artist-run centers, the people around the table. Like maybe who even knows? Like I think who is around the table, right? So like they're not going to care if you were sick, or they're not going to care if you had kids. Like, you know,
But artist-run centers might be a little more
maybe be a little more. But like I know, like
sympathetic,
at Canada Council, there's,
Yeah.
do they really care? It's like, do they really care that you're in PEI? It's hard.
Clearly not. I
I
would
know.
say.
I know. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what's more important. To do that. I mean, like when I had my kids, I definitely planned ahead so that I had writing. I was writing for magazines. I was doing things to add to my CV. I had a touring show going, so like there was things that were doing that complemented my CV, even though I didn't have like a solo show within the past 5 years since I had my kids, but. I have had work to add into it, and it is a conscious effort on my part. But I think as administrators and people who are deciding what work gets exhibited or who gets the artist residency is ensuring that the peer assessment jury or the peer review that you go through selection has a diverse representation around the table. I think that's one way of sort of helping.
Yeah, that it's truly peers.
Yeah, like so that there's a
But
variety.
you're talking about like people who know this experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I
And
mean, I've been on juries where that has come up, where somebody has said, "Yeah, she just had a baby." Mm-hmm. That does. It's interesting how jury conversations have changed from a very purist, discussion about the work to something more complicated, like where did this person grow up, or what is their identity that they, how do they identify themselves? I mean, these kind of things are now all part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So the distinctions between the work and the author and all that are not so clear as I'm making it sound, but they still are. There's a certain extent to which they're unavoidable, because in a way, no matter how much the artist is present to kind of justify the work, talk about the work, perform or whatever, in the end, there is still this kind of separation that happens. And actually, I think it's important for an artist to separate themselves from their work and recognize the distinction between their work and themselves. Otherwise, you get caught in this sort of ego trap that can be.
yeah, like unless you are using persona as a mode.
Perhaps even more when you use
Yeah, maybe
persona,
then perhaps when you're
need
a
to,
persona, you need to separate yourself from that persona. Like I've experienced that before with doing the Queen work or sovereignty and dealing with that. How do I separate that from myself? I mean, that work it has a lot to do with white supremacy, and it's a difficult conversation. So, it's like it is hard to separate yourself from your work these days. And I don't know if it has to do with the professionalization of artists or the businessification of artists, in the sense that they are now talking about like branding themselves, about utilizing social media and creating your identity,
Your avatar.
your avatar online. What is your presence? Who's watching? I think that all of this is very interconnected, but
Well, in a way, you're talking about a way in which what we think of as art practice has actually invaded every aspect of everyday life. So,
yeah.
the idea of kind of self-construction, which was a kind of artistic strategy, I would say, at one time, is now like something we all do. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all curate, we all art, all the
We
time.
all art.
All the time. And
Hashtag
so
art.
now what the artist is trying to do, what's the distinction? I guess artists are kind of forced to always be nimble and find the ways to what Michael Fernandez would call the sweet spot, where things are still in play, where there's somewhere to intervene. Mm-hmm. there's something that's about to happen, or where there's areas of potential.
Yeah, I
and
mean, in
that's where you have
photography,
to-
they would call it like the pregnant moment.
Yeah, there's always that
Yeah, for lack
question
of
of
a
like,
better
where
saying.
is there a place where things haven't, where I'm not speaking through cliches or, conventions that have been rendered sort of kind of ineffective somehow, or they've become totally co-opted by certain kind of structures or networks or whatever. Like, where are those places that there's still some kind of room to move?
Yeah, or freedom.
Freedom. I know. I'm
Back
trying
to
not to say
freedom.
freedom, but that's basically what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, like,
So sometimes that freedom could be, like, we were going back to PEI. I mean, sometimes that really, for all those sort of frustrating things about PEI. I mean, one artist I know laughed when I was doing an exhibition about emerging artists on the East Coast, and he said, "Nobody's on the East Coast to emerge; they're here to submerge." And I thought, yeah, unfortunately that's very true. But maybe that could be, maybe that's that sort of untimeliness of being kind of out of the loop can be really beneficial.
well, and I also think, like, all artists should just think, artists on PEI should think about how being on PEI impacts them as an artist,
Yeah.
potentially. Yeah. Because it does. You're removed, you're isolated,
But it sounds like there's, part of this is there's that room for intentionality. So you, and in that professionalization or not, you were thoughtful in, I am going to have children, and historically or traditionally that's going to impact my ability to continue with my profession. So you figured out ways to maintain that profession while being able to pivot over here and look after the tiny humans when they really needed it.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, Pan, that whole idea around making that, like, it's the intentionality of making a choice. I am making a choice to be on PEI rather than, just thinking about that rather than being surprised all of a sudden that, the contemporary world is moving along unless you're really thoughtful about hanging out there.
Yeah, or like staying connected, auditing fine art courses, or, researching online, like staying connected on PI is important.
Yeah, but you can't
deny that you're not connected,
Yeah.
it's just a physical reality.
Sure.
You also can't keep up, really. So
No, because it's so
like,
fast.
don't try to keep up with everything, because
Yeah.
then you're just kind of a passive receptacle of, like, whatever's happening.
Yeah.
Ultimately, to establish any kind of voice whatsoever, you have to kind of turn off the TV every once in a while,
Yeah.
or whatever it is. You have to, forget to be. If you know everything, there's nothing to say. It's interesting that, for example, if you think about, like, a lot of the great writers and artists of the last 100 years, they're rarely born in Manhattan. They're usually from, like, Montana or, like, Pittsburgh or something. And then the kind of arrival in the city, say, is somehow, they bring something fresh or something. Maybe there's a misunderstanding, or there's a kind of an urgency to what they're doing. And maybe even a little bit of ignorance can help you make work. You can't even, like, if you know too much, you can't even do anything, because you're like, oh, it's already been said.
But not by you. And it's already been said, but not by you,
Yeah, okay.
right? In your context of your place and time, right? Like, there's always ways of writing your story that makes you stand out.
But it
from
can
other
be
people.
paralyzing to
Yeah,
be
it
in
can
it,
be, yeah.
and to kind of be, in a way, too aware. So, like, sometimes being a little bit blind can, there's a...
Well, it can paralyze you, being too aware, that's for sure. I felt that before, being like, how can I even make anything?
Yeah.
I'm just going to become the artist that doesn't make anything. And, because how can you make something new in 2019? It's but there's some interesting stuff happening. And I mean, like, I wonder what Hannah_G's artist statement is. So Hannah G, she would have been at Flotilla, coming from Alberta. She teaches at the Alberta College of Art. Is that what it's called?
ACAD?
ACAD?
Alberta College of Art and Design.
Art and Design, yeah. Anyway, she works on social media on Instagram. So it's at Hannah G, Hannah_G. And so she uses that platform as part of her art. Like, that's the platform for her art. It would be interesting to see how that might be brought into a gallery, if it could ever be there. But it would be an interesting thing for people to look at. So I'll include a link to her as well after the fact. But I do want to say, if you're applying to a grant, follow the requirements to a T and make sure that your photos are good. Make sure that they are file named appropriately and that you understand the system that you're submitting to. Because if you don't, then you might be deemed ineligible, or the jury's just going to be pissed off that you wasted their time with bad pictures.
Yeah, maybe a few practical, real advice as opposed to all this.
But just like that's good advice. That's like practical advice. If they want the photos in chronological order, then do it.
Good
Pay
pictures.
attention.
Good pictures is key. If how many Art in the Open proposals have people sent us that describe something that it's hard to understand what's being described? So a drawing or an image would be really helpful.
Yeah.
But it also sort of proves that you can do it. Like, if you can't even draw a picture of what you have in mind, that's a very bad sign. It means you're not really that fluent in visual language or visual, expression. If drawing a picture, those kind of drawing can often be the foundation of nearly everything with art, just because it's a kind of way of expressing yourself that isn't verbal. And draw a picture, please.
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
I love that that's how we're going to wrap up, is with that really sort of practical, follow the instructions. And I have to say that, at the end of this conversation, I'm really struck by how many similarities there are between being an artist and running a not-for-profit organization. Like, when you think about that artist statement, that is your mission, your vision, and your purpose. And everything drills down from that. So I do think there's some really neat synergies between, those same sort of skills that we need, that we need in 2019 to be artists, are actually really similar to the skills that we need to run or not-for-profit organizations. So on that note, Becka and Pan, I do really want to thank you for this very fascinating conversation.
Thanks. We always like to
having us.
talk.
Yeah.